The cathedral stood against the morning sky like a monument to permanence itself. Inside, 200 people sat in press suits and designer black, their faces composed in that particular expression, the wealthy, where when grief is expected of them. The air smelled of lilies and old money. Everything was in order. Everything was as it should be, except it wasn't. At the back of a cathedral, near the heavy oak doors, a man stood who didn't belong. His clothes were worn thin at the elbows. His hands were weathered from nights spent outside. And when he spoke, his voice cut through the organ music like a stone through glass. He's not dead. By the time this story ends, the truth will be clear. But it won't be easy to accept. The funeral was for Marcus Chen, 73 years old, founder and CEO of Chen Pharmaceuticals, a man whose name appeared on hospital wings and university buildings, a man who, according to every medical professional in attendance, had died peacefully in his sleep 3 days prior after a brief illness. The death certificate had been signed. The obituary had run in the Times. His children sat in the front pew, their faces pale and appropriate. His business partners occupied the rows behind them, already calculating how his shares would be divided. But now this homeless man stood in the aisle, and no one moved. What was really happening behind those cathedral walls? Why had no one questioned the circumstances before? And how had a stranger, someone with nothing, someone invisible to people like this, become the only person willing to speak? If you appreciate stories told with depth and patience, take a moment to subscribe and like this video. It helps this story reach others who value meaningful storytelling. To understand what happened that morning, you have to go back 6 months. Back to when Marcus Chen was still very much alive, still making his daily walk through downtown on his way to the office. Marcus had a routine. Every morning at 6:30, regardless of weather, he walked the same route. Past the coffee shop where he never stopped. Past the park where the same people slept on the same benches. Past the corner where a man named Daniel sat with a cardboard sign and a dog named Lucky. Most people didn't see Daniel. Or rather, they saw through him the way you see through air. But Marcus had learned, over the course of 30 years building a pharmaceutical empire, that the most important things are often the ones people overlook. It started with a nod. Just acknowledgement. Then one morning, Marcus stopped. "Your dog looks sick," he said. Daniel looked up, surprised that someone had actually spoken to him. "Yeah, I think so. But vets cost money." Marcus knelt down, examined Lucky with the careful attention he'd once given to laboratory reports. "Infection in the paw. Needs antibiotics. Wait here." He returned 20 minutes later with medicine and instructions written on the back of a business card. Daniel stared at the card, at the name printed there, at what it meant. "I can't pay you for this," Daniel said. "I didn't ask you to." That's how it began. A routine within a routine. Marcus would stop, sometimes for 30 seconds, sometimes for 5 minutes. They talked about weather, about the city, about nothing in particular. Marcus never asked Daniel how he'd ended up on that corner. Daniel never asked Marcus why someone like him would bother. At the time, it all felt normal. Looking back, it never was. Because what Marcus didn't tell anyone, not his children, not his business partners, not even his personal physician, was that he'd been diagnosed 6 months earlier. A rare neurological condition. Progressive. Terminal in most cases. But Marcus Chen hadn't built an empire by accepting most cases. He'd been researching, experimenting, using his own company's resources to develop a treatment that existed nowhere else in the world. Something radical, something dangerous, something that, if it worked, would be revolutionary. If it failed, it would be fatal. He told no one because he knew what they'd say. They'd tell him to stop, to accept his fate with dignity, to spend his remaining time with family instead of in a laboratory chasing impossible solutions. But Marcus had never accepted the impossible. 3 weeks before the funeral, Marcus stopped showing up for his morning walks. Daniel noticed immediately. After months of routine, the absence felt loud. On the 3rd day, Daniel did something he'd never done before. He left his corner. He left Lucky tied to a post with water and walked the 12 blocks to Chin Pharmaceuticals. The receptionist looked at him the way people like her always looked at people like him. "You need to leave. I need to speak with Marcus Chun. Mr. Chin isn't seeing anyone. You need to. Tell him Daniel is here. Tell him it's about the morning walks." Something in his voice must have carried weight because she made the call. And to her visible shock, she was told to send him up. Marcus's office occupied the entire top floor. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city like a god's view of his creation. But Marcus himself looked nothing like a god. He looked sick, thinner than he'd been 3 weeks ago. His hands trembled slightly as he gestured to a chair. "You shouldn't have come here," Marcus said. "You disappeared. I've been busy. You look like hell." Marcus laughed, but it turned into a cough that took 30 seconds to subside. "I'm fine. The treatment is working. It has to work." "What treatment?" And that's when Marcus told him everything. The diagnosis, the experimental protocol, the fact that he was essentially using himself as a human trial, documenting every symptom, every reaction, pushing the boundaries of what the human body could endure in pursuit of a cure that might save thousands of people with the same condition. "If this works," Marcus said, "it changes everything. Not just for me, for everyone who comes after. And if it doesn't, then I die." But I was dying anyway. Daniel sat quietly for a moment. Then he said, "Who else knows?" "No one. If my board found out, they'd remove me. If my children knew, they'd try to stop it. This is the only way." That was the moment Daniel understood. Nothing's going back to the way it was. "What do you need?" Daniel asked. Marcus looked at him, really looked at him. "Why would you help me?" "Because you stopped. Because you saw Lucky. Because for 6 months, you treated me like a person. Not many people do that." So Marcus told him. He needed someone to check on him, to monitor his condition when he couldn't trust his own judgment, to make decisions if he became incapacitated. Someone outside the system. Someone who couldn't be influenced or bought or convinced to do what was profitable instead of what was right. He needed someone who had nothing to lose and everything to gain from simply telling the truth. He needed Daniel. The next 2 weeks were the hardest of Daniel's life, and he'd lived through some hard weeks. Marcus gave him a key to his private residence, a penthouse that Daniel couldn't have imagined existed outside of movies. He gave him a phone with one number programmed in. He gave him instructions written in Marcus's careful handwriting, instructions that Daniel read over and over until he had them memorized. "If I lose consciousness for more than 6 hours, call this number. If my vital signs drop below these thresholds, call this number. If I tell you to stop the treatment, don't listen to me." The neurological symptoms include paranoia and impaired judgment. "I'm trusting you to know the difference between rational fear and chemical confusion." Every evening, Daniel would leave Lucky with a friend from the shelter and make his way to the penthouse. He'd check Marcus's vitals, document his symptoms, watch as this brilliant, proud man deteriorated in the name of science. There were nights Marcus couldn't remember who Daniel was. Nights he accused Daniel of trying to kill him. Nights he begged Daniel to end it, to stop the treatment, to just let him die with whatever dignity remained. And Daniel, who had nothing and was nobody, had to make decisions about whether to honor those requests or ignore them. If you're still here, let me know by commenting "still watching." Stories like this are meant for those who stay until the truth is revealed. Don't forget to click the subscribe button. The conflict wasn't just medical. Marcus's absence from the office had been noticed. His children began calling, began showing up at the penthouse. Daniel had to hide, had to watch from Marcus's bedroom as Marcus's daughter stood in the living room and demanded to know what was wrong, why he looked so sick, why he wouldn't see a doctor. "I'm fine," Marcus would say. "Just tired. Getting old." But she wasn't convinced. None of them were. And then Marcus made a mistake. He collapsed during a board meeting. Just for a moment, long enough for paramedics to be called, for doctors to examine him, for questions to be asked that Marcus was too weak to answer properly. That's when his family made their decision. They had him admitted to a private medical facility. They took away his phone. They told the doctors to run every test, to find out what was really wrong, to fix it by any means necessary. And they told Marcus that Daniel was no longer welcome, that whatever relationship he'd had with that homeless man was clearly a symptom of his illness, that they were protecting him now. Marcus tried to explain, tried to tell them about the treatment, about the research, about why it mattered. But the neurological symptoms made him sound paranoid, made him sound irrational, made him sound exactly like a sick old man who needed to be protected from himself. So they stopped the treatment. They gave him conventional medication that Marcus's own research had shown would be ineffective. They made him comfortable. They told him to rest. They told him he was in good hands. And then, 2 days later, they declared him dead. Daniel got the news the way most people do, from a newspaper left on a bench. Marcus Chun, pharmaceutical pioneer, dead at 73. Services to be held at St. Catherine's Cathedral. In lieu of flowers, donations could be made to the Chun Foundation. Daniel sat with that paper for an hour, reading the obituary over and over, looking at the photograph of Marcus, healthy, confident, nothing like the man Daniel had known these past weeks. Something was wrong. He went to the medical facility where Marcus had been taken. The receptionist wouldn't tell him anything. Patient privacy. He went to Marcus's office. Security escorted him out. He tried calling the number Marcus had given him, the emergency number, the one that was supposed to connect to Marcus's private physician, the one person besides Daniel who knew about the treatment. The number had been disconnected. That's when Daniel understood. This wasn't about Marcus dying. This was about Marcus disappearing. He had no proof, no evidence, just the instructions Marcus had written, which Daniel still carried in his pocket. Just the knowledge of what the treatment should have done, given time. Just the certainty that 2 days wasn't long enough for Marcus to have died from his underlying condition. The funeral was the only chance. The only moment when Marcus's body would be present, when the truth might still be provable, when someone might listen. So Daniel did something he'd never imagined doing. He cleaned himself up as best he could. He walked into St. Catherine's Cathedral alongside people who would never have let him through the door under normal circumstances. And he waited. He waited through the opening hymn, through the eulogies delivered by Marcus's children, who spoke about a father they'd never really known, through the business partners who talked about vision and legacy and profit margins. He waited until the moment the priest began the final blessing, until the moment the casket began its slow procession toward the door. And then he stood. He's not dead. The music stopped. 200 people turned to look at him. Marcus's daughter stood, her face pale with fury. Security began moving down the aisle, but Daniel kept speaking. His name is Marcus Chun, and 3 weeks ago he asked me to save his life if it came to this. He was undergoing an experimental treatment for a neurological condition. The treatment was stopped 2 days ago when his family had him hospitalized. But 2 days isn't long enough. The compound he was taking has a half-life of 48 to 72 hours. If you open that casket right now and check his vitals properly, not the way they were checked when he was declared dead, but properly, you'll find signs of life. This is insane, Marcus's daughter said. Security, remove him. But the priest raised a hand. He'd been standing closest to the casket, and he'd seen what everyone else had missed. The casket moved. It wasn't much, just a slight shift, the kind of thing you'd dismiss as imagination or the settling of weight. Except caskets don't move on their own. It wasn't what they expected, and that's what made it so difficult to accept. The next few minutes happened in a blur. Someone called for a doctor. The casket was opened. Marcus lay inside, pale and still and looking exactly like a dead man should look. Except his chest rose. Barely. But it rose. The doctor checked his pulse. Faint. Irregular. But present. Call an ambulance, the doctor said quietly. Now. Marcus Chun didn't wake up for 3 days. When he did, he was in a hospital room with his children on one side and Daniel on the other. The doctors had been briefed. They'd found traces of the experimental compound in his system. They'd found evidence of the treatment, evidence that showed it had been working. Marcus's condition had been improving slowly but measurably until the treatment was stopped. The neurological symptoms that made him seem paranoid? Side effects. Temporary. The collapse at the board meeting? Not a deterioration, but a crisis point in the treatment. A moment where the body fights hardest before it begins to heal. If the treatment had been allowed to continue, if he'd had another week, Marcus would have made it through. Instead, his family had stopped it, had declared him too sick to make his own decisions, had chosen comfort over cure because they thought they were being kind, and they'd nearly buried him alive. The conversation that followed was private, but afterward, Marcus's daughter made a statement to the press. She talked about the importance of respecting patients' wishes, about the gray areas between protection and control, about how love can sometimes look like cruelty, and cruelty can sometimes look like love. She didn't apologize, but she didn't need to. The weight of what had almost happened was apology enough. As for Daniel, he sat by Marcus's bedside and asked the question that had been bothering him since the cathedral. "How did you know?" Daniel asked. "How did you know I'd show up? That I'd say something?" Marcus smiled weakly. "I didn't. I just knew that if anyone would, it would be you. Because you're the only person who had nothing to gain from my death and nothing to lose from my life. Some stories don't end with victory. They end with understanding." Marcus Chun completed his treatment. 6 months later, his neurological symptoms were gone. His company is now conducting clinical trials on the compound that saved his life. Trials that will help thousands of people who suffer from the same condition. But the real story isn't about the medicine. It's about who we trust when everything is at stake. It's about the difference between being seen and being noticed. It's about how the people closest to us can sometimes be the ones who understand us least. And it's about a homeless man who had every reason to walk away and chose to walk forward instead. Daniel still sits on the same corner downtown, still has his cardboard sign and his dog Lucky, who's healthier now than he's been in years. But these days, when people walk past, some of them stop. Some of them ask his name. Some of them see him. Marcus stops by every morning on his way to the office. They don't talk about what happened. They talk about weather, about the city, about nothing in particular. Because that's what the routine was always about, not grand gestures or dramatic rescues, but the simple recognition that every person matters, even when the world suggests otherwise. What would you have done differently? Where do you think the line between loyalty and truth should be drawn? When does protecting someone become controlling them? And who gets to decide when a life is worth saving? If stories like this matter to you, subscribe to Vivid Stories. Here, we tell stories that don't just entertain, they stay with you. The next story may feel different, until you realize how close it is to your own life.